I had just moved out of my parents' house, finally stepping into the life I had always dreamed of. I landed a job at eBay, a company I'd always admired, and I wasn't alone in this new adventure. My college buddies, Peter and Anthony, had also secured positions there. Together, we packed our lives into suitcases and made the cross-country journey to San Jose, California. Our new home was a large, old house that stood on the outskirts of the city. It had character. With its creaking floors and antique charm, there was something off about it. Occasionally, we'd hear strange sounds, creaks and whispers that seemed to echo through the halls. At first, we laughed it off. After all, we were three young men living our dream. What was there to be afraid of? The days were a blur of excitement and hard work. We thrived at eBay, and our nights were filled with the vibrant life of San Jose. The house, with all its quirks, was just a backdrop to our newfound freedom and success. But as the weeks turned into months, those odd noises became harder to ignore. It was a typical Friday night. Peter, Anthony, and I had just returned from a night out. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows through the windows. We were tired, yet elated, recounting the night's events as we climbed the stairs to our rooms. As I reached my door, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. There was nothing, just the dimly lit hallway and the distant sound of Peter and Anthony's laughter. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Dear what?" Peter replied, pausing at his door. "Never mind," I muttered, shaking my head. I didn't want to come off as paranoid. We bid each other goodnight and retreated to our rooms. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. A faint whisper, almost like a distant conversation. I sat up, straining to catch the words. They were too muffled, too indistinct. My heart pounded as I listened. Every creak of the old house amplified in the silence of the night. I told myself it was just the house settling, the remnants of a long night playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that house. Something, or someone, was watching us. The dream started to unravel 3 months in. Peter and Anthony were transferred to a different office, leaving me alone in that big old house. The silence that followed their departure was deafening. I've always struggled with depression and anxiety, my mother's constant worry whenever I mentioned moving out. Alone in that house, every creak and whisper seemed amplified. The first night after they left, I lay in my bed, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The sounds, the shadows, the oppressive weight of the silence, it had to be my anxiety acting up. I tossed and turned, sleep evading me. Then I heard it. Distinct, sharp sound, like nails scraping against wood. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. "Get it together?" I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But the rational part of my brain struggled against the creeping dread. I took my medication, hoping it would calm my racing thoughts. As the minutes ticked by, the house seemed to grow quieter. The silence was thick, almost tangible. Every breath I took felt like a roar in the stillness. By the end of the week, the sounds had become more frequent, more insistent. During the day, I buried myself in work, trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at my mind. But at night, when the house wrapped me in its cold embrace, there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker and more defined. I could no longer chalk it up to anxiety or the creaks of an old house. One night, I decided to confront my fears. Armed with a flashlight and a determination fueled by sheer desperation, I crept through the house, checking every corner, every closet. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. As I entered the living room, the air grew colder. I could see my breath misting in the beam of the flashlight. I heard it again. The whisper, clearer this time, chilling in its clarity. "Your time is coming," it said, a voice that seemed to echo from all directions. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a logical explanation. There was none. I was alone in that house, yet I wasn't. Something was there with me, something unseen and malevolent. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. I stumbled back to my room, barricading myself inside. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every whisper seemed to promise impending doom. I lay there, eyes wide open, heart pounding, waiting for the dawn to bring a semblance of safety. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't stay in that house another night. I found a smaller, cozier apartment closer to work, hoping the change would bring some peace. But the terror I felt in that old house lingered, a dark cloud over my every waking moment. My new apartment was a stark contrast to the old house, a modern, cozy studio just minutes from my workplace. I moved in with a sense of relief, hoping the fresh start would banish the lingering dread. But that first night in the new place, I realized my nightmare was far from over. As I settled into bed, familiar sounds began. At first, it was just a faint whisper, a distant echo that could easily be dismissed. But then, it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear the words. The voice was different this time, clearer, as if it were right beside me. "Your time is coming," it whispered again, the words sending a chill down my spine. I turned on every light in the apartment, desperate to dispel the darkness. The whispers stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was just residual anxiety from the old house. Trick my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The following nights brought more disturbances. Objects moved on their own. Books falling off shelves, chairs scraping across the floor, lights flickering without reason. One night, I woke to find my phone on the other side of the room, though I was certain I'd left it charging on the nightstand. And then came the figures. Translucent, shadowy forms that flickered at the edge of my vision. They moved quickly, almost imperceptibly, but I knew they were there. I could feel their presence, cold, oppressive force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. One evening, as I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with TV, power suddenly went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the room. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner, watching me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, a shadowy silhouette against the dim light. Blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced, panic clawing at my throat. Couldn't stay there, not another minute. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside, gulping in the cold night air. The next day, I confided in my manager, John. He listened patiently as I recounted the terrifying experiences, his expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "Maybe it's stress," he suggested gently. "This job can be overwhelming, especially when you're dealing with anxiety and depression. Why don't you take some time off? Get away for a bit?" His words made sense, but I knew it wasn't just stress. Something sinister was following me, something I couldn't escape. But I nodded, agreeing to take a short leave. I needed to get away, to clear my head, and figure out what was happening. That night, I packed a small bag and drove aimlessly for hours, too scared to return to the apartment. Eventually, I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town. The room was dingy and musty, but it felt safer than being alone in that haunted place. As I lay on the lumpy mattress, exhaustion finally overcame my fear. I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of shadows and whispers. The nightmare had followed me, and there was no escaping it. The hotel room became my refuge, temporary escape from the relentless terror that plagued me. Each night, I would collapse onto the bed, exhausted but too afraid to close my eyes. The nightmares followed me, whispering threats in the darkness, but at least here, I felt a thin veil of safety. It wasn't long before I realized I couldn't live like this, hopping from one temporary shelter to another. I needed a permanent solution. The idea of moving yet again was daunting, but I had no choice. I scoured listings, finally finding a small, cozy apartment in a well-lit building close to work. It seemed perfect. A fresh start in a place that didn't carry the weight of the old house's history or the eerie disturbances of my previous apartment. With cautious hope, I signed the lease and moved in, determined to leave the horrors behind. The first night in my new apartment, I took every precaution. I left the lights on, kept the TV playing softly, and made sure all the windows and doors were securely locked. As I lay in bed, I forced myself to breathe deeply, to relax. This was a new beginning, a chance to reclaim my life. But the peace was short-lived. It started with the lights, flickering, dimming, then flaring back to life. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a faulty electrical system. But then came the whispers, seeping through the walls, insidious and relentless. "Your time is coming," they repeated, a sinister chant that echoed in my mind. The shadows followed soon after. They darted across the room, just at the edge of my vision, vanishing when I turned to look. My heart pounded, a relentless drumbeat of fear. I sat up in bed, clutching the covers, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. Figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was barely visible, translucent shape that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, too terrified to move. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there. Silent sentinel of dread. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. Minutes felt like hours, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. Finally, I mustered the courage to move. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the figure remained unaffected, watching me with unseen eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from the bed, running to the door. As I reached for the handle, it felt ice cold, chill seeping into my bones. I yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air washing over me like a balm. I sat on the steps trembling, my mind racing. This was no longer just a haunting, it was a relentless, malevolent force that seemed intent on driving me to madness. I knew then that I couldn't face this alone. I needed help, someone who could understand what I was going through and offer a way out of this nightmare. The next morning, I called my manager, John. My voice shook as I recounted the events of the previous night. The terror that clung to me like a shadow. "I believe you," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "You need to get out of there. Come to the office and we'll figure something out." Desperation drove me to agree. I packed a small bag and left the apartment, not daring to look back. The city felt alien, the bright sunlight a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed my nights. I arrived at the office, feeling like a refugee seeking asylum. Don was waiting for me, concern etched on his face. "We're transferring you to Florida," he said without preamble. "You need to be somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. I've already made the arrangements." Relief washed over me, mingled with lingering fear. Florida. Home, close to my family. It sounded like a dream, a safe haven from the terror that had become my life. I nodded, grateful beyond words. As I boarded the plane that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching, still waiting. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could escape the nightmare and find peace again. The plane ride to Florida felt like a journey from darkness into light. As the miles passed beneath us, I could almost feel the oppressive weight lifting. The thought of being close to my family in a place where I'd always felt safe was a beacon of hope. Yet deep down, a sliver of dread lingered. Would the shadows follow me even here? I landed in my hometown, a small city not far from my parents' house. The familiar sights and sounds were a balm to my frayed nerves. I rented a modest apartment, a cozy space that felt worlds away from the haunted homes I'd left behind. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope that the nightmare was finally over. The first night was uneventful, and I slept deeply for the first time in what felt like ages. But the second night, the whispers returned. I was jolted awake by a cold breeze and the now familiar chant, "Your time is coming." My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed by fear. I knew I couldn't go through this alone anymore. The next morning, I made an appointment with a psychiatrist, hoping they could offer some explanation, some way to banish the terror that had taken root in my life. Dr. Adams was a kind, understanding woman who listened intently as I recounted everything. The noises, the whispers, the figures. Her expression was one of concern, not disbelief. "You've been through a lot," she said gently. "We'll work through this together. But I want you to know that you're not alone." Her words were a small comfort. She adjusted my medication and scheduled regular sessions to help me cope. For a while, it seemed to help. The whispers grew fainter, the shadows less frequent. But the fear never fully left me. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I shot up, heart racing, and saw a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was clearer now, more defined. My breath caught in my throat as it spoke, the voice chillingly familiar. "You can't escape," I screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the apartment. I scrambled out of bed, knocking over a lamp in my haste. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching. I grabbed my phone and bolted out the door, not stopping until I was outside, under the bright streetlight. I called my parents, my voice shaking. "Can I come over? I need to be with you." They agreed without hesitation. I drove to their house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, they welcomed me with open arms, their concern evident. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, surrounded by the comforting familiarity of my childhood. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were silent, the shadows absent. The peace was fleeting. Over the next few days, the terror crept back in. Objects moved on their own, and I heard faint whispers even in the safety of my parents' house. I realized then that the haunting wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to me. Desperate, I returned to Dr. Adams, explaining the new development. Her brow furrowed with concern. "We need to dig deeper," she said. "There's something in your past, something unresolved that might be the key to all of this." We began intensive therapy, delving into memories I had long buried. It was painful, confronting old traumas and fears. But slowly, we began to uncover the roots of my torment. There had been an incident in my childhood, a time when I had felt completely powerless and terrified. I had suppressed the memories, but they had festered, manifesting now as the horrors that haunted me. With Dr. Adams' help, I began to confront those old fears, to face the darkness within. It was a long, arduous process, but gradually, the whispers grew fainter, shadows less oppressive. I learned to reclaim my power, to assert control over my mind and my surroundings. The terror never fully disappeared, but I learned to live with it, to manage it. I continued my sessions with Dr. Adams, finding strength in the progress I had made. My days were never the same as before, but they became bearable, even hopeful at times. And while the shadows still lurked at the edges of my vision and the whispers occasionally echoed in the silence, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer running. I was facing the darkness. And in doing so, I had found a way to reclaim my life. In 1999, I was just a high school student trying to navigate the usual teenage dramas. But one night, a night that still haunts me to this day, changed everything. It was June 11th, a Friday. My parents, who usually worked during the day, had to stay late for overtime. They left me alone in our big, cozy house, a house that on any other night would have felt safe and warm. But not that night. That night, the storm outside seemed to have a life of its own. Lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating every corner of my room in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder roared, shaking the very foundations of the house. Each clap felt like an omen, harbinger of something dreadful. Rain pounded against the windows, relentless and deafening. I sat on my bed, clutching my blanket, trying to convince myself it was just a storm. Then, the noises started. First, it was just the wind howling through the trees, a normal enough sound on a stormy night. But soon, the house began to groan and creak, as if it were alive. Doors slammed shut in rooms I knew were empty, and the doorknob on the front door rattled as if someone or something was trying to get in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drumroll of impending doom. The lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. It was like being inside one of those horror movies I used to watch, only this time, I was the protagonist. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. The signal was dead. Worse, it was. This was the kind of night where nothing went right. Then, all at once, everything went dark. The rain stopped, and the house was swallowed by an unnatural silence. For a moment, it felt like time itself had paused. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. My heart seemed to be the only sound in the world, thudding loudly in my ears. And then, phone rang. 3 sharp, shrill rings cut through the silence like a knife. Each ring seemed to vibrate through my bones, freezing me in place. I stared at the phone, too terrified to move. Who could be calling at this hour, in the middle of a storm? Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, each one ending in blood and screams. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was even worse. The storm might have paused, but inside that house, the real terror was just beginning. The silence hung heavy, a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any indication that I wasn't alone. The wind outside had stilled, and even the relentless rain had ceased its assault on the windows. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Then the noises began again, but this time they were different, more deliberate, more sinister. Front door, which had been securely locked, creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. My heart skipped a beat as I heard it slam shut with a force that rattled the walls. The doorknob turned back and forth, as if some unseen hand was testing its resolve. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The lights flickered once more, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch and twist into monstrous shapes. Each flicker revealed a fleeting glimpse of the room, warped and distorted by my growing fear. It felt like the house itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Suddenly, everything went dark again. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the empty hallways. They were slow at first, but with each step, they grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were heading straight for me. In the darkness, I could see nothing. I felt everything. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and chilled your soul. My skin prickled with goosebumps as the footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. A loud crash from the basement shattered the silence, making me jump. The sound echoed up the stairs, a deep, resonant thud that reverberated through the floor. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm, just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I heard laughter then, soft at first, like the distant chime of a bell. Grew louder, more maniacal, filling the house with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a laughter that didn't belong to this world, a laughter that promised only pain and suffering. I glanced at the phone, hoping against hope that it would ring again, that someone, anyone, would call and break this nightmare. But it sat silent, a lifeless piece of plastic that offered no solace. My only option was to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. Gathering my courage, I crept towards the door, each step a monumental effort. The laughter continued, mingling with the sound of my own ragged breathing. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew that whatever lay beyond this door could change my life forever. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the unknown. The doorknob felt icy under my fingers, and as I turned it, I prayed for the strength to face whatever horror awaited me. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air greeted me. It felt like a dark, malevolent force was waiting just beyond the threshold, ready to consume me. My heart hammered in my chest as I peered into the hallway, shrouded in darkness. The eerie laughter was gone now, replaced by an even more unsettling silence. I stepped out into the hallway, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. The house seemed to stretch out endlessly, its shadows warping and twisting in the dim light of the emergency lantern I had managed to find. Footsteps had stopped. The memory of their slow, deliberate approach still haunted me. It was as if they had never truly left. I could feel an unsettling presence, chilling sensation that someone or something was right behind me. Every breath I took seemed to echo in the empty house, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a face peering at me from the darkness. There was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the cold, empty air. The basement door, which had been ajar, now seemed to groan under its own weight, as if protesting against its own existence. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The fear had become unbearable, palpable force pressing against my chest. I had to escape. I turned back towards my room, but as I did, I heard a loud, sickening thud from the basement, followed by a strange, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was so close, I could almost feel it. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible. With a surge of adrenaline, I sprinted back to my room, grabbed my jacket, and threw open the window. The wind howled outside, and the rain had started up again, falling in relentless sheets. I had no choice. I jumped. The fall was brutal. I hit the ground hard, the rain mixing with the mud beneath me. My legs buckled, and I let out a strangled cry of pain. I glanced back at the house, its windows glowing with an eerie light, as if it were alive and watching me. I had to get to safety. I limped through the rain, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, every sound a reminder of the terror I had left behind. I made it to my uncle's house, barely able to knock on the door before collapsing. My uncle, shocked and concerned, let me in without question. We waited in his warm, safe house, the storm raging outside, until the lights came back on. When I finally felt it was safe to return home, my heart was still racing, my hands trembling. The terror of the night had not left me. It had only begun to unravel. When dawn finally broke, it brought no relief. The sky was a dull gray, as if even the sun was reluctant to witness the aftermath of that night. My parents and I drove back home, a sense of dread hanging over us like a thick fog. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind replaying every horrifying moment. As we pulled into the driveway, I was struck by a sickening sight. The house looked like it had been through a hurricane. The once cozy living room was now a chaotic mess of overturned furniture and scattered belongings. It was as if some invisible force had gone on a rampage, throwing everything into disarray. My parents were speechless, their faces pale and their eyes wide with disbelief. I tried to explain what had happened, but my voice trembled with fear. I had to relive the nightmare in every word, every description. But my parents, though concerned, couldn't fully grasp the terror that had gripped me. We began to clean up, though I felt like I was moving through a dream. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed alien, hostile. Every creak and groan of the house sounded like a mocking reminder of the horrors that had occurred. The basement door, which I had been too terrified to check before, was now firmly shut, its surface marred by scratches I hadn't noticed before. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking in the shadows. The eerie laughter from that night seemed to echo in the corners of my mind, a haunting refrain that wouldn't go away. I glanced nervously at every dark corner, every flickering light, saw nothing, only the silent, accusing stare of the house. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The events of the previous evening replayed in my mind like a twisted movie I couldn't turn off. I kept hearing footsteps, faint but persistent, and I could feel the icy presence that had haunted me before. I was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Years have passed, and though life has moved on, that night remains etched in my memory. Every storm, every flickering light, every strange noise triggers a wave of terror that takes me back to that dark, rainy night. I still can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will. The house was never the same after that night, and neither was I. Even now, when the wind howls and the rain pounds against the windows, I find myself reliving those moments, fear clawing its way back into my heart. The terror of that night is a ghost that never leaves me, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the safety of the familiar. I learned that some horrors are not confined to the dark corners of our imagination. They live in the shadows of our reality, waiting for the right moment to strike. And for me, that moment came on June 11th, 1999. It was 1995. I had just moved into this old house in a new neighborhood. I didn't know anyone around here, and the place still felt strange and unwelcoming. It was a rainy night, kind where the wind howls and the rain pelts down so hard you can barely hear yourself think. I was alone, trying to settle in, surrounded by boxes and the remnants of my old life. I remember that night vividly. The electricity had flickered a few times, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I had just sat down with a book, trying to drown out the unsettling sounds of the storm, when it happened. A loud, frantic knock on the front door shattered the fragile peace. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out in this weather, knocking on my door with such urgency? I hesitated, my mind racing with possibility. Maybe it was a neighbor in trouble, or perhaps someone who had broken down in the storm. But deep down, A sense of dread clawed at my insides. I got up slowly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house, and made my way to the door. As I reached for the handle, I paused, then decided to turn on the porch light first. The yellow glow illuminated a figure standing there, drenched from head to toe. His clothes were torn, hanging off him in ragged strips. Mask covered his face, and his hair was a tangled mess, dripping with rain. He had a small cut on his cheek, trickling blood that mixed with the rainwater. "Can I use your phone?" he gasped, voice hoarse and urgent. "Some guys are after me, and I need to call the police." Every instinct told me to shut the door and call the police myself. The fear in his eyes was so real, so palpable. I swallowed hard and stepped aside, letting him in. I pointed to the phone, my hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his breath ragged. As he walked past me, a chill ran down my spine. Little did I know, the real horror was just beginning. He stepped inside, leaving a trail of water on the floor, and headed straight for the phone. Closed the door behind him, the sound of the rain now muffled but still roaring outside. The air inside the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if the storm had followed him in. I watched him from a distance, my eyes fixed on his every move. There was something unsettling about him, something that made my skin crawl. Picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. I could hear the operator's voice faintly, asking about the emergency. But instead of pleading for help, his voice took on a strange, calm tone. "I need to report a crime," he began, his eyes flicking towards me, then away. "A double murder that happened a few weeks ago." My blood ran cold. I felt like the walls were closing in, the room growing darker, the air thicker. He continued speaking, giving the operator an address I didn't recognize, the names of victims I'd never heard of. His voice was steady, almost detached, as he described the gruesome detail. "I stabbed them both," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper now, yet it felt like a scream in my ears. The woman tried to fight back, but I couldn't listen anymore. My mind was reeling, trying to process what was happening. Was this real? Was I dreaming? I looked around, desperate for something, anything that could help me. That's when I saw it. The shotgun I had been cleaning earlier, leaning against the corner of the living room. My heart pounded in my chest. The stranger was still talking, his back to me. I moved slowly, trying not to make a sound, inching towards the shotgun. Floorboards creaked under my weight, but he didn't seem to notice. I reached it, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal. I lifted it, feeling the weight, the power it held. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and then stepped forward. "Hey," I called out, my voice surprisingly firm. He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the shotgun pointed at him. "Step away from the phone." He hesitated, then raised his hands, a twisted smile creeping onto his face. "Oh," he said hoarsely, "you're gonna shoot me now?" "Not if you don't move," I replied, trying to keep my voice strong, though inside I was trembling. "Just stay where you are." The operator's voice was still on the line, frantic, asking what was happening. I lifted the phone with my free hand, keeping the gun trained on him. "Do you hear what he's saying?" I demanded. "We have a car on the way," dispatcher replied, her voice calm but urgent. "Just keep him there." "I've got a shotgun aimed at him," I said, my voice shaking now. "Not going anywhere." For what felt like hours, but must have been only minutes, we stood there, locked in a standoff. The storm raged outside, the tension inside unbearable. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and I felt a rush of relief. The police were here. 2 officers burst in, towering figures in the doorway. They moved quickly, efficiently, taking the stranger into custody. As they led him away, he turned to me, that twisted smile still on his face. "Thanks for the call," he said, his voice dripping with menace. I watched them go, the adrenaline slowly draining from my body, leaving me weak and shaky. The house felt empty, eerily quiet now. But the horror of what had just happened lingered, a shadow that wouldn't leave. After the police took him away, the house was eerily silent. The storm still raged outside, but inside, it was as if the air itself was holding its breath. I slumped into a chair, the events were playing in my mind. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the image of his eyes as he confessed to those murders, the calmness in his voice. It was as if he had rehearsed it, planned it. The details he gave were so vivid, so precise, that it left no doubt in my mind. He was the killer. I glanced at the phone, still hanging off the hook, the operator's voice faintly asking if I was okay. I picked it up and spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear everything he said?" "Yes," she replied, tone grave. "The officers will handle it from here. You did the right thing." But had I? I let him into my home, gave him access to the phone. If I hadn't had that shotgun, if the police hadn't arrived when they did, thought made my stomach churn. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind set my nerves on edge. I kept seeing his face, twisted smile, hearing his voice in my head. By morning, I was exhausted, but there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. I called the police station the next day, desperate for answers. They told me he was a patient from a nearby mental institution, off his medication. That wasn't all. He was indeed a murderer. One they had been hunting for weeks. He had escaped custody during a transfer, jumping out of a moving vehicle, which explained his disheveled appearance. "You were lucky," the officer said, his voice serious. "He was dangerous. You did well to keep him there until we arrived." Lucky. That word echoed in my mind. I didn't feel lucky. Felt haunted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his confession. Fear didn't leave when he did. It stayed, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of how close I had come to something truly horrific. From that day on, I couldn't stay in the house alone. Every knock at the door, every unexpected sound set my heart racing. I started seeing things, shadows that moved, figures standing in the corners of my vision. I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me, but knowing didn't make it any less terrifying. The anxiety grew, tightening its grip on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The house, once a symbol of a fresh start, became a prison. Memory of that night was a weight I couldn't escape. And always, there was the lingering question. Why me? Why my door? Why my phone? The randomness of it all was the most terrifying part. I began to understand that the horror didn't end when the police took him away. It stayed. Part of me now, a darkness I couldn't shake. The house might have been empty, but the terror it held was all too real. And it was here to stay. As days turned into weeks, the shadows in my home seemed to deepen. The memory of that night was a specter that refused to leave. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, the sense that something or someone was always just out of sight. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by long, restless nights filled with anxiety and dread. One night, as I sat in the darkened living room, phone rang. The sound jolted me out of my thoughts, my heart racing as I picked it up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "It's Officer Daniels," the voice said. "I wanted to update you on the case." My grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "We've learned more about the man who came to your house. He was more dangerous than we initially thought. Multiple homicides, not just the double murder he confessed to. His escape was planned. He wanted to find someone isolated, someone he could manipulate." The words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around the room, feeling the walls closing in. "So why did he come to me?" "The randomness is what makes it so terrifying," Officer Daniels replied. "He chose your house because it was dark, because you were alone. But you handled it well. You stayed calm, and that's what saved you." Calm. The word seemed almost laughable now. There had been nothing calm about that night, nothing calm about the way my life had spiraled since then. But hearing it from the officer gave me a strange sense of closure. I thanked him and hung up. The fear still lingered. It wasn't just about that night anymore. It was about the shadows that had crept into every corner of my life. I had to find a way to reclaim my home, my sanity. I decided to make a change. I couldn't keep living in fear, letting the memories control me. I started seeing a therapist, talking about the anxiety, the nightmares. Slowly, very slowly, the shadows began to recede. I also took steps to make my home feel safe again. New locks, brighter lights, even a security system. It was all about taking control, about not letting the darkness win. The process was slow and painful, but it was necessary. Months passed, and while the fear never completely vanished, it became manageable. I began to reclaim parts of my life that had been lost to the terror. I started seeing friends again, venturing out of the house more. Each small step felt like a victory. Then one night, as I was settling into sleep, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat, but this time I didn't freeze. I grabbed my phone, checking the security camera. It was a neighbor, someone I had come to know and trust. "Just wanted to check on you," she said when I opened the door. "Saw your light was still on." I smiled, a real genuine smile. "Thanks. I'm okay, really." As I closed the door and locked it behind her, I realized something. The fear would always be a part of me, a shadow in the back of my mind. But it didn't have to control me. I could face it, live with it, and move forward. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept soundly. The storm had passed, and while the memory of that night would never leave me, it no longer held the same power. The horror had given way to something stronger, resilience. And that, I realized, was the true ending to my story. If you liked this real and horrifying story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Check out this other real horror story appearing in the video. Thanks for watching.